My name is Laurie Adami, and I was diagnosed 18 years ago, so in 2006, with stage 4 non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and the type of lymphoma I had was follicular non-Hodgkin. So I was diagnosed in 2006. My son was in kindergarten. There was one treatment, which I did right away. We thought I was in remission, so I went merrily back to work, traveling internationally. But just 3 months later, my cancer was back on the first follow-up scan. So that started 12 years of treatment. So from 2006 to 2018, I was in continuous treatment and underwent 7 different lines of therapy, including 3 clinical trials. And the first 6 didn't work, unfortunately, but thankfully the 7th line of treatment did work. I live in Los Angeles, so I had access to great cancer centers. So I went to 4 different big cancer centers in LA. And that's where I was able to get trials. So I was really lucky to live in LA because I had access to all these different facilities and access to all these specialists and new trials. When my son was 3 years old, I started to get frequent sinus infections and just couldn't get rid of them. I also developed a dry eye. I was a longtime contact lens wearer, and I suddenly couldn't wear my right contact lens. And I was very tired. I had a lymph node on my neck that was concerning me, and I felt something in my abdomen. And my doctors all roundly dismissed me. I think it was a function of being female and also blonde. Didn't help. I would specifically ask them, I'm very worried I have lymphoma. And they would say, well, look, your blood work is all normal, so you don't have cancer. And I even took my husband with me to these appointments and he couldn't believe how I was dismissed. And he was mortified. He could not, because I told him they won't listen to me, and he didn't believe me. So this went on for a good 3 years. And I wanted to believe these doctors. I wanted to believe that it was just allergies that, were causing these sinus infections. And also, too, I was dismissed because I was considered in the age where I could be starting to get perimenopausal symptoms. So my hormones. Yeah, a lot of people get dry eye because of their hormones. And, it was the most aggravating thing. But I just kept feeling worse and worse and worse. And then the exhaustion. The exhaustion was really incredible. And one of these doctors I saw, he said, Laurie, he said, I'm listening to you, and you're president of a software company. You're traveling internationally a week, you're traveling a week a month. You're running a household. You have a young boy that you're managing him, because no matter what happens, the mom always does so much. My husband had his own business, so he had his own challenges. And he said, I'm just exhausted listening to you. So I finally got to someone I knew who might know a diagnostician. And she referred me over to this diagnostician who took me seriously at last. And so I went in to see him. I explained everything. I said, people think this node is just from allergies. And he said, well, did you get tested for allergies? And I said, yeah, and there was nothing. So he said, okay, well, that doesn't make sense then. And I explained about the hernia. And he said, yeah, it feels like it could be a hernia. But he said, Laurie, we don't guess. We have CT machines. And I'm going to send you to a hernia specialist. We're going to image you. And that week, they imaged me. And it was really scary because I was supposed to go in for a simple image. They expected to find a hernia, and I wasn't supposed to have contrast. And suddenly this lady's bringing in the bottles of white gunk. And then they said, they had to run an IV line because they had to do a better image. So my heart just began to sink as I was sitting there. And just 2 days later, on Good Friday, the Good Friday of 2006, the doctor's office called and said I needed to go in that day. And they didn't tell me to bring anyone with me. I just went in by myself, and they told me I had some sort of either lymphoma or a mesenchymal tumor they had also, the imaging had also detected lesions on my lungs. So he said, you may also have lung cancer. And that's when I found out, and that I had some sort of cancer. I knew a little bit about lymphoma just because when I had this node, like when I put in my symptoms, it kept coming up lymphoma. But 90% of lymphoma patients are diagnosed at stage 4 because most patients don't have symptoms. Now, I did, but I didn't have anybody listening to me. So they just dismissed my concerns. And as it turned out, it was actually really good that they didn't listen to me, because the only treatment that existed at the time, this monoclonal antibody multi-chemo prednisone treatment, if I had had it 2 or 2.5 years earlier, it wouldn't have worked and I would have had nothing else. I mean, as it was, I had an auto stem cell as an option, but it was not a good option, especially if you relapse after that first line of chemo and monoclonal antibody treatment. So in a way, I had to say, it ended up kind of being a blessing, because by the time then they were pushing me to do the auto transplant, I managed to find a trial of an HDAC inhibitor, which is what I did as my second line of therapy. So the doctor who had first diagnosed me and treated me, I remember, when I relapsed, she said, well, you should go do an auto transplant. That's what is standard second line of therapy. But I did the research on my own to look at the statistics. And that's when I saw that 50% of follicular patients would relapse within a year of getting auto transplant. And if you failed first line, the relapse rate was even higher. And then I would have had to undergo even more intense chemo than that first one. And I would have had to be in the hospital for a month. And, by this point, my son was in first grade, and I couldn't be in the hospital for a month. So I made the rounds in LA, seeing all the doctors, trying to get opinions. I reached out to oncologists through Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. They connected me with some other specialists for follicular. And so I talked to doctors at Mayo, at Dana-Farber, at MD, all these different facilities. And they all said, Laurie, we don't really have anything that unique for follicular. So, we suggest you keep digging in LA. And so I went to this huge transplant center in LA and actually met with the head of transplant. And he wasn't happy because he wanted to transplant me. My girlfriend said, yeah, he'd transplant his dog if he could. But when I told him about my son and not being able to, I literally could not do it. Unless I could figure out how to get my brother or sister to leave their work and come out here for a month, I couldn't do it. So he agreed to see if he could find a trial. And that's when he identified this clinical trial of an HDAC inhibitor. It was a phase 2 trial, which meant it was beyond phase 1. So the safety profile had been established. And this HDAC inhibitor was also FDA approved for T-cell lymphomas. So they were using it for T-cell lymphomas. So I knew it was even better understood because it had been gone through all of the clinical trials for T-cell. And I figured if it could buy me time, I wasn't overly optimistic because the numbers weren't great in terms of response rates and complete remissions. But I figured if I could get on this and avoid chemotherapy, so an HDAC inhibitor is really a small molecule drug that is more targeted. And I figured, well, the more targeted it is, that means it should be more effective and it should have fewer side effects. Also, too, being in that clinical trial, I was blown away by how well supported I was. So, I couldn't, unlike the first standard of care, which, you're just in the general patient population, when you are in a clinical trial, you are assigned a clinical trial coordinator who sets up, I had to get biopsies, I had to get imaging baseline, she just scheduled everything for me. I gave her open dates. She scheduled everything. She would meet me at my appointments. She would escort me to my appointments. She would follow up with me on a very regular basis, Laurie, how are you feeling after I started the drug? Are you having, because they have to report all the side effects. Are you having side effects? What are you experiencing? And it was, and this was true for all three clinical trials I did. So much better and so much more targeted, definitely fewer side effects. I did do a phase 1 study about 4 years, 3 years after that first one, that was a little bit less well understood in terms of the side effects. But again, they were all over it. There were trials that were done, particularly in the Black community, that impacted the outlook and the sense of, gee, that's scary stuff. But now they're able to model so much more that they couldn't model before, because they can actually, even before they get into say a lab animal, they can model so much in the petri dish. They can do so many computer simulations to understand. It's so different now than it was. So different. And that's why, and I knew that, and that's why, I originally would go on clinicaltrials.gov looking for new trials and then reach out to researchers. And that's how I found my fifth line of therapy, which was a trial, was through clinicaltrials.gov. And so now Leukemia and Lymphoma Society has a clinical trial program where you can call them, you give them your diagnosis, you can send them your pathology report so they can see if there's any kind of mutations in that. You send them your treatment history, and within 48 hours, they will run you a report in whatever geographic area you specify and find you trials. They'll even call the investigators and find out if there's still spaces, and they'll find out if it will cover transportation. Let's say you have to travel to Bethesda, Maryland for the NIH. Because I actually helped a patient who did just that. She was in Los Angeles. CAR-T had failed her. Bispecifics had failed her. And LLS found her this trial, and she ended up getting all of her expenses covered to go out to NIH. They even paid her housing, her airfare, everything. So LLS and it's a free service. The patient pays nothing. But unfortunately, you have to know about LLS to know about the service. And LLS doesn't advertise their services because they want the money to go to the mission, which is to cure cancer, to help patients financially, and to advocate legislative change to benefit cancer patients. So they don't, because money to advertise is expensive, So that's why the patients really have to be there for advertising, people like me. It was very much a roller coaster. Every time I would get on a new treatment, I would read as much as I could. I would talk to as many patients as I could who'd had it before me, and I would get hope, right? So every time I would have this hope, and it would get dashed. So I used antidepressants during my treatment just to get my level up. And I'll tell you, the big motivator was my little boy. When he was in kindergarten, one of the doctors told me I had a 50% chance I would be alive in 2 years. That's terrible. And I was going to do anything and everything because I wanted to see him grow. And he was my son. I mean, every parent that says this, but my son was the sweetest and and he grew up really fast because he had a sick mom. So, I mean, and just the thought of my husband saying, Mommy died was enough to get me to get out of bed, put my swimsuit on, go swim some laps at the community pool, go take a walk, take him to a Dodger game. I remember when I was on that PI3 kinase inhibitor that gave me the Crohn's, and it was, had gotten tickets to one of the first games of the Dodger season, and I was feeling so crummy, so crummy, that I said, Gus, I don't think I can go. He said, that's okay, Mom, I understand. No worries. And then I was lying down in bed, and then I thought, screw it, I'm going to go. I took like 4 Imodiums. I put on a diaper. I said, we're going. And we did. And we had the best time ever. And it was fine. I just didn't eat anything at the game. I was like, it's like, but it was hard and it was not easy. And I dealt with depression. especially at the beginning when I was first diagnosed, because you don't know, it's like a bomb goes off in your head. You don't know what to do. You don't know who to talk to. You don't know how to get help. I didn't know about Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. If I had, it would have been helpful because they have so many people that can help navigate, help you find specialists, help you find treatments. I mean, all this stuff I didn't know. So it's just, yeah, it was a roller coaster. But every time I would get a new treatment, and I remember the night before I went in to get my CAR T cells back, and my son said, he was crying, Mom, we've done this so many times. Why do you think this is going to work? I said, because this is truly different. This is not a pill or an infusion coming off a factory line, one size fits all. They are using my cells, engineering my cells. I just knew it had to work better. And lo and behold, a month after CAR T, I was in complete remission. 6.5 years later, I'm still there. In 2018, I mean, my tumors were huge, huge. And in 2000, it was like April of 2018, I was out hiking. My oncologist called me and said, we finally got the trial for follicular. It's going to open at UCLA. We're going to have 5 patients enrolled in the first cohort, and you will be patient number 1. So then I went in and I had to do, when you're in a trial, you have to go review the paperwork. You sign the study paperwork. It discloses all the side effects other patients who were in the phase 1 study had. And this was a phase 2 study by this point. So it wasn't completely bleeding edge. And then they have to do biopsies, they have to do imaging, they have to do MRIs. They had to make sure I didn't have anything in my brain because at that point, they weren't allowing patients with central nervous system to get CAR T because they didn't know yet how it would work and what it would do. Now they know it's amazing. So they do it for people with involvement in the central nervous system. About a month before you get your cells back, they do apheresis. So they harvest your T cells. Very easy process, half a day outpatient. Then they take the bag, the courier leaves with your bag to ship it to the CAR T company, who happened to be just down the highway in LA because I was getting Kite and they were just in El Segundo. So I remember the courier came to pick it up in the apheresis center and I said, do not let my cells fall out on the freeway. Please make sure the van door is tightly sealed. He said, don't worry, we'll get it there, Laurie, no problem. And then it's about an 18-day process, but they take the cells and they put the target on it and then they grow the cells in the lab. So they harvested about 1 million cells from me. And after they became CAR T cells, they were now 1 billion cells that were going to get infused into me. And then just before you get your CAR T cells, you go through lymphodepleting chemotherapy, which is really chemo light and compared to the 18 chemo cycles I had. What it does is it makes room in your bloodstream for you to get your CAR T cells back and to give them room to expand. So that's why they do this 3 days of lymphodepleting. And then on your day 0, your CAR T birthday, you get the cells back. It was amazing because within days, the tumors were shrinking. When I was diagnosed, I felt very strongly that I needed to talk to someone on the road ahead of me to give me hope. Because I'm sitting here looking at statistics, feeling hopeless, feeling I'm going to die. And just coincidentally, I got connected with a woman who had follicular who'd been diagnosed 5 years before me, and she was doing well. And a lot of these nonprofits have programs to connect a patient with someone on the road ahead of them. And that can give you a lot of hope because you're reading all this negative stuff. And then I said, wow, this woman's already been alive longer than me. That means I can be that too. I can survive too. And that gave me hope. And every time I looked at statistics on a trial or a new line of therapy, even if it said 12% complete remission, there was hope that I could be that 12%. And, by the time I got to CAR T and I heard that 3/4 of the phase 1 study participants got into complete remission, oh my word, that gave me even more hope. So I try to instill that in my patients. And I oftentimes will also talk to their caregivers who may be feeling really down. They don't really understand. They don't really understand the treatments. They don't understand what their loved one might be going through. And so I try to give them that hope that the medical personnel that are working with their loved ones is very expert at what they're doing with these treatments, at how to handle any side effects should they come up. So I really try to reassure them based on my own experience, and I can share that, and when I talk to patients about clinical trials, oh, do you think I should do that? Because now there's tons of clinical trials for CAR T because they're starting with new targets. They're starting to work on new diagnoses, so, and I'm always based on my own experience, I can share my experience with trials and what a positive part that was for my journey. And if I hadn't had those trials, I would be dead. I have no doubt I wouldn't be here. People say to me, Laurie, why are you doing this? You should just move on with your life. And I say, but I survived because of my good fortune, because these things opened. So I remember when I got out of the hospital, I was talking to my husband about what am I going to do with my life? He said, you're going to raise awareness of CAR T, and you're going to try to help other patients get CAR T, and you're going to work with them on their journey, because they, just like you had no one, they have no one, and you have to be there. And that's what I've done. I mean, that's my whole thing in life. I spend about 20 hours a week talking to patients, on a volunteer basis. And it gives me so much, because I hear the relief in their voices and in their families' voices, because it's so scary.